us off, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, and then what you do at Liger?
So I am the chief strategist at Liger. So I work with our clients to establish their strategies moving forward. Liger is a full service marketing firm, and we focus primarily on B2B marketing. So we work with complex businesses that are, not necessarily selling sodas or t-shirts. They're selling something that takes a little bit longer to understand. We really like companies that are in the middle of either doing M&A, they might be merging with another business and they're kind of messy. So while other firms might run away from that, we actually like those kind of projects.
Awesome. And can you tell me a little bit more about what appeals to you about the kind of complexity of B2B and or the messiness of, for example, working with someone who's in the middle of an M&A process?
So I have to go back a little bit into my background. So I'm a recovering technologist. So I ran
Okay.
development jobs very early in my career and then helped companies put together professional services organizations around their products to take them to market. Owned a research company for a period of time. And really and truly, at the heart of who I am, I'm an operations guy. So I do marketing, but it's about operations because marketing nowadays is you got to be consistent and you got to make sure your message is out and it's the right message and those types of things. So I look at things from an operational slant. So when we start to work with these companies that are going through M&A and they're trying to do, all this messy stuff, it's really like taking a big complex puzzle and cleaning it up, like making it work more succinctly. So I used to use Beautiful Mind, the movie Beautiful Mind, but then someone reminded me that he was crazy. And so maybe the accountant, I like see all the numbers and how they should match to each other and then work towards making things simpler and more clear and more concise, which is really what marketing is all about. Don Draper was right that you can only deliver one message, but he was wrong about a lot of things. But that's, making sure you got that one clear message that your intended customer understands about you.
Got it. So your perspective is you're trying to bring order to chaos in a certain way. And
Yeah,
on the topic of being crazy, I mean, sometimes being a little bit crazy helps in this line of work. So
yeah,
nothing against
absolutely.
that.
Well, our mission statement is saving the world from boring, broken marketing. And most B2B marketing is either boring or broken, or it's both. And so if you think about, messy, non-conform marketing, it's something in that process is broken and you're not really spending your money the most effectively or efficient way.
Yeah, I think I remember something from your site about something along the line, or maybe it's your LinkedIn taglines, something about marketing that doesn't suck. Is that
That's a good way to put it. And marketing should be visceral. So it needs to make you feel something. Either hate it, love it, but don't make it like neutral, and a lot of B2B marketing is very like blah, right? You don't pay any attention to it. So how do we make sure that people are paying attention? And if you think about complex products, you're educating somebody along a buyer journey and you have to keep them engaged and you also have to be reinforcing your brand effectively and within that. So it's harder. Like transactional, I can run a discount or a sale or a buy one, get one free, and I can get you to convert. But if I'm trying to get you to make a decision that's maybe a dangerous decision, because that's typically what B2B decisions are. Like if I decide to put a software in house and my boss doesn't like it, I could get fired or look like an idiot, right? So there's a lot more risk around the type of work we do. And I say the word B2B, I really mean relational. So something that's relational and educational in nature versus B2C is transactional. So it's an easy buy. If you make a mistake, no big deal. But typically when you do something that's more in this other category, it could be a dramatic impact.
yeah, and I really liked one thing you said about not wanting to fall in the middle with your marketing. And I think because of the dynamic you're describing, where there is a lot more, reputational and professional risk associated with these, larger B2B products or decisions. Uh, on the buyer side, you have people who tend to be quite risk averse, and then you sometimes see that get reflected on the marketing side, where a lot of B2B companies, they want to be right there in the completely safe and not challenging middle, where
Yeah.
it's very bland, to use maybe not so kind of a term, but kind of boring, right?
Yeah.
And so falling on one side or the other, I think, if you fall on the side where they hate it, well, they might hate it, but at least you were memorable. Um,
100%.
and ideally, you fall on the side where you're memorable and they love it.
Yeah.
So actually, tell me a little bit more, like, how do you think about differentiating in the B2B marketing space? So to you, I guess if you want to define what makes for boring marketing, high level, and then what makes for great marketing from a
So if
B2B
you're a
perspective.
financial institution and you pick a blue logo, you've immediately already decided you just want to be boring, right? So we'll
Okay.
do a color wheel of all the competitors and where they fit. And typically we do a lot of financial institutions and banks and insurance, and they're always either blue or green, right? So
Mhm.
a number one way to do it is just to like do a different color, like stand out in some way, like make people pay attention. Also, picking a lot of standard stock photography that you're going to expect that looks like one of those success magazines, those posters they used to do, this is what success looks like.
Yep.
So we work very hard to come up with some kind of an activation concept on the back end of what we're doing that's going to make you pay attention. That's going to make you see the brand, understand the brand, talk about it. We were working with one financial institution and we had suggested a logo that had a very long stripe on it. And they could not get their mind around that stripe. They're like, why is that stripe there? They kept talking about it. And I'm like, that means this logo wins because we are talking about it, right? Like that's what you want to do because you've got to get people to pay attention. And for marketing, it takes 21 touch points to get someone to build awareness. 21 touch points. And so you need to make sure you're being very consistent and noticeable across those 21 touch points, such that you're not losing out on what your ultimate conversion is going to be because you've spent all this time and effort trying to get someone to know who you are and pay attention to what you do.
Can you give us, do you have like a favorite example that comes to mind? Maybe it could be a success story from your own experience or just another brand that you really like, someone who stands out and kind of exemplifies what you're talking about here.
So the companies that exemplify it are the ones that we all like to talk about, right? Like, so the Apples and the Targets and the Old Navies and the, Fidelities or whatever. And what's interesting is that they never make the mistake smaller brands make. And so a large brand like the white between Old Navy, Target, and Apple is different. There's a different white between each one of them.
Mm.
You can tell when a commercial starts which one it's going to be just if they start with a white screen. You can almost already know, oh, this is going to be an Old Navy commercial, or it's going to be a Target commercial. They are very consistent with their brands. They could afford to make a mistake because they have these huge marketing budgets. What I see small companies do is they're like, oh, we're bored with the logo, so we're going to tweak it a little bit, or we think we've run that message too long, and so we're going to change it out. And that is a problem because what you've done is you've thinking of research, you've reset what the customer thinks the brand is or who the brand is going after or what the brand does. And so smaller brands with smaller budgets need to be far more consistent and far more picky about how their brand shows up in the world such that they are building that recognition. One specifically that I like that in the kind of financial category, there's a Fisher Investments does a great job with just continually staying in front of you. They've done all their information to know kind of how much your portfolio is because they're telling you, hey, if you have this much money, you should probably be doing this thing, right? So they've used that to really speak to a problem that people are concerned about, money, running out of money during retirement, if they have enough to retire, and they stay in front of you over and over again until you just have to hit the button. Like, I just got to hit the button. I've seen it so many times.
Got it. And so that kind of brings us into, the topic of research and customer insights, really understanding who it is you're going after, what their pain points are, what their kind of uh, situation is, so that you can effectively get in front of them across channels. So, can you tell me a little bit about your perspective? We'll start at a high level here, just uh, how you kind of approach customer and market research, and you can talk about your go-to methods and maybe tell us about some common pitfalls that you see brands kind of falling into in that area.
Yeah, so I'm an old school guy from that perspective because I've been doing this before it was cool to do it. So back in the day, we took a product into what was called a usability lab at that point, and we watched it fail miserably. So no one could put their credit card in, no one knew how to use the system, whatever. Early 2000s, technology was really hard, and we had to build research such that we could make users use the technology. Nowadays, the individual customer user is hard and the technology is easy. So we've seen a huge twist from, hey, make sure the screen, people can click and yada, 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 understanding the context and where that customer is, or that desired prospect is, as they're using the technology and consuming it. So I went from being kind of like a lab based, let's follow this like protocol, whatever, to ethnography and understanding the environment and all the other kind of factors around who this person is. And we have so much choice now, right? And so I love kind of combination of qual and quant. So give me something that gives me a smoking gun, but then let me have a few conversations such that I can understand what that smoking gun really means. People lie in research over and over again. They'll tell you that, it's about price, but at the same time, if it's worth it to them, they'll go spend whatever they want on something that's really important to them. So you've got to get beyond that and make sure that you're really understanding the core reason someone's making a decision. So it's not one technique. It's a combination of things, and seeing what the tea leaves are telling you as you start to look at it, and not ignoring it, because we all come in with kind of implicit bias anyway. It's like, oh, I think this already. And that was always my favorite thing about the research companies. We'd have big companies bring us a problem. They're like, hey, this thing's not working, and this is why. They would tell us why. They're like, it's not working for this reason. And I'm like, well, I love that that's what you think it is. But we're going to step way back from the problem and bring people into it. So like, don't start with the problem, you start with the person, and you move from the person to the problem and see if what your thing is that you built solves for what they really care about in their world and the way that they look at things.
Yeah, I love that when they start and they bring you the answer that they're also hiring you to solve. It
Yeah.
can feel.
And then you bring back the answer and they say, oh, you spelled common sense. And I'm like, well, if it was common sense, you would have already solved the problem, right?
Yep,
But
we wouldn't be here.
right.
So on the topic of kind of understanding the why, so you kind of took us through at a high level. There's a mix of methods, qualitative and quantitative, and you described it as you kind of have to read the tea leaves. So it's a little bit of art, a little bit of science.
Yeah.
On the qualitative side, what are your kind of preferred methods? And something that we say at our company is we help people get to the why. So there are a million ways to understand the what. I don't like this sweater. I really like this car.
Yep.
Great. I'm glad you like it. Why?
Yep.
That's what we ultimately want to know, so that we can adjust the product and adjust the marketing accordingly. So when it comes to getting to the why, how do you approach that?
So I wrote a book in 2013 called Laddering. And so I use a concept called laddering, which is also a financial term if you ever look it up. So it's like a way to do, investing over time. But laddering is a research technique, which is asking why 5 times. So you don't like that sweater, why? Well, I don't like the color, why? And then you'll probably get to some like childhood memory, the color yellow, I, got bit by a yellow dog or something. There's like some really fundamental, like at the very bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs that you're driving towards, that like is the reason. And that's my ultimate goal, is to understand it, because then you can start to understand patterns across people. And people all think they're very different, and they really aren't. Everyone kind of falls into these like categories as you start to do the work. You're like, oh, okay, which we call personas if you've done correctly. It is incredibly important, as I said earlier, to start with the person and not the problem. So I want to take them very broadly, like, talk to me about your day. Like, what do you do? Where do you go? What's the factors? Are you very busy? Who influences you? Those kind of things. And then start to move them into the context that we're discussing. So you use the example of a sweater, shopping. Well, how do you shop? What do you shop for? What are you looking for? What, da, da. Then down to, we're talking about sweaters because it's fall, right? So many people start at the bottom. They start with like, here's the sweater, what do you think of it? And you really need to you got to pull them back, because you can't broaden them once you've narrowed them. So if you narrow them too quickly, you can't bring them back. Like any researcher who's ever tried to do that, like, you'll have a point in which you're doing the research and you've narrowed them, and then every answer after that is about the thing you narrowed them to, and you're like, I'm not talking about that anymore, stop, right? So it is really important to like build that top funnel that brings them down, and then make no assumptions. I make zero assumptions about what the research told me. I do want to look at it as quickly as possible, which is why some tools like what you have in your company help with is to, what are the patterns? What am I identifying? What am I seeing? And also not being biased. And we always would do that in several groups, right? Because I did one project where I was certain money was one of the factors. And I had a researcher I was working with, and she's like, nope. And I'm like, well, I think it is. And so we were in this war room, like all the stuff up and drawn and whatever. And we realized money had nothing to do with it, right? But I would have introduced that implicit as a bias because I wasn't being checked, right? So it's a little art and it's a little science, it's patterns. It's why I love it, because it's like the ultimate for me, like from a brain perspective. I love to walk into like this thing and figure out like what is really the thing going on. So yeah, that was probably a long answer. The big
No,
answer
that's
is
great.
why. Ask why 5 times like a 2-year-old, like why, until you annoy the person, and don't let them get away with a flip answer. Like, don't tell them, cause it's like, no, that's not an answer.
Right.
Also why I hate focus groups. Hate them. So focus groups, you put unlike people in a room and ask them to give you an opinion about something, and you can do focus groups on personas, but if you do focus groups on like just demographics and whatever, you're talking to like 8 different people and you don't realize it. That's where you're getting these mixed messages. And companies rarely spend enough money on focus groups and or do them inappropriately. Like they'll change the protocol from focus group to focus group, so they're not getting enough pattern. So I'd rather have 8 individuals tell me something and see a pattern than have 8 people in a room tell me something. So those one-on-ones, they seem harder. They're not. Specifically, you've got a tool that helps you to collect it and understand it and look at it. And you're going to get much better data out of that than you are the old class. Let's put everybody in a room and show them the sweater. Let's not. Let's talk to each one individually and see what they think of the sweater. So yeah.
That's a great that's a great way to kind of capture some of the drawbacks of the traditional methods. They might have their time and place, but especially with respect to focus groups, talking about introducing bias, because there can be bias introduced on the part of the researcher, but there can also be bias introduced on the part of the other voices in the room. If there's 8 people and 7 of them say, I hate that sweater, you're going to feel real awkward saying like, oh, I kind of liked it, but now,
Well,
now I'm not so sure.
or class, like we saw several where people were like, oh, what do you do for a living? Oh, you got a doctor and a nurse in the room, and they already had some kind of like belief, so there's these things that get introduced and they're so subconscious, you have no idea that it's even going on, and then all of a sudden you're building all of your research off, or all of your assumptions off of what's really flawed data.
Right. So we kind of touched on collecting the data. I'd love to hear kind of your perspective on how you integrate that data into your marketing programs for your clients. So you've done the work to understand their customers or target customers, built the personas, and you're an operations guy. So once you have you understand the why and the who the people are, how does that kind of flow into your marketing programs? How do you get people aligned around a single source of truth, make sure the messaging consistent? So yeah, I'd love to hear how you approach that.
Yeah. So one thing that people start to think about in that category very quickly is like, what's the message and what are the words? And that is a part of it.
Mhm.
Like, different audiences that you're going after, and you're typically only servicing 3 to 5 personas with any product, but those 3 to 5 personas have different messaging. So you may sell the same product to them with different words, right? So messaging is part of it. And like we were working with a very large telecommunications company that's expensive, and people use it because it's easy or it's the best. Those are the 2 reasons. And their social media people kept trying to get people to interact with them by saying, hey, download this thing, it's free. Well, no one uses them because it's free. So they should have used the word easy or best. And they could tell the difference based on their social media. Like if you went and look at their social media account, you know if it was an easy person or a best person. So you know which one to say to them, right? So that's a messaging example. The other example that we see is behavioral. So certain personas will follow certain paths or be attracted to certain content throughout your site, your digital experience, your store, whatever. And so if you can start to identify that, then you also know something about what you should do for them. We're working with a travel company. They wanted to redesign their website for an older generation. We found out the older generation wasn't necessarily their target. It had to do more with like travel mode for these people. And so we built the site such that all three were represented on the site. And then as people selected one or the other, we then knew what other content to show them, because one of the travel modes wanted a lot of written words about itineraries and things. The other was more into like videos and pictures. So the site would change and flow based on how you kind of made those initial selections. So it's message and path, right, that you're thinking about as you go through. And if you do it right, people give themselves away all day long. Like it was my favorite when I was doing research solely, because now I do marketing, because marketing is a combination of research and technology. That's really what it is.
Yeah.
It was my favorite cocktail party trick. It's like if I was doing a persona project, trying to like put somebody in their persona group, and you do it right, you can ask like 3 to 5 questions and you know what persona someone is within a context.
That's awesome. That is a great party trick.
I was always sad when I found out I was like what I thought was the worst persona in a research project. We'd be doing the
Oh
person. I'm like,
no.
oh, I'm not that guy. And I'm like, oh wait, yeah, that's me.
When you see it out there in the world, you're like, oh man, that's the dead end persona over there. You're like, oh, wait a second.
I think I relate. Like we were doing one that had what we would consider like a person who's kind of first to find, and then there was the person who spread things and acted like they were the first to find. And I thought I was the first to find person until I started to see the other people who spread it. And I'm like, oh wait, I'm the spreader. I'm not the first to find. So yeah.
um, can you tell me maybe a little bit more about for in the context of B2B, like what are the kind of main channels that you're usually operating on, and how do you integrate your kind of findings from research into how you show up on those channels? So you mentioned messaging, you mentioned path. So maybe could you just tell me a little bit more about that? Yeah, what are like kind of the typical paths that you're seeing people take, and how do you kind of understand that from the research?
Yeah, so it does. So we talk about BATCOM, so branding, awareness, traffic, conversion, optimization, and maintenance. So that's the path that people follow: branding, awareness, traffic. And everybody wants conversion. The whole world wants conversion. Nobody cares about the rest of them, but you can't get to conversion unless you have traffic, and you can't get to traffic unless you have awareness. You can't get to awareness unless you have a good brand, right? So we step them back, looking at the brand, thinking about how it maps to your competitors and to your customers. So does your brand feel like it would be in the same room as the companies you're going after, right? So like people hang out with like people. And so that is an important part of it from a like aesthetic. And, do I feel like that this is a company I believe in, trust, understand, even at a very visceral level? So that is one of the things we want to consider. The more important thing is understanding that your owned things, so your booth, your digital properties, your store, whatever, is the last place that customer is going to go to get their information. So what's the rest of their ecosystem? Like, are they reading things on Reddit, or are they on certain magazines, or they're following this person? So we need that content that we're creating, or those assets we're creating, to flow out to all the other places that are influencing that person to make the decision to finally visit one of the assets that you have out there. So we're not expecting that the first thing somebody's going to do is go to a landing page and download an asset, and all of a sudden we've got their email. We think that's the last thing they're going to do. And so how do we support them along the path? Because people like to buy, they don't like to be sold. And so you want to let them feel like they're buying, and getting enough information, collecting it. And everybody's smart enough now that they know the first time they visit one of your owned assets that you're going to start tracking them. And that's the last thing they want you to do. So we want to understand their overall, like, where do they go? What are their sources of truth and influence? And start to live there, making sure that as we drive them to centralized assets, that those are their best assets that they can kind of connect to then make a really good decision. Because the problem is, like, they're making 70 to 80% of the decision out here in the outer ring. And then it's that 20% at the end where if you don't do that right, you lose all that work you did, right? And that's when marketing departments get in trouble. They're like, oh, that asset's not working. Well, everything else you were doing may have worked. We just need to like fix the very last mile of the buyer decision.
Right. And the thing I like about what you're describing here is it's it's zooming back out, so that we're not just fixating as as marketers on that last mile where we're saying, oh, I'm going to optimize all these buttons on my site, and maybe if I just tweak the web copy, it kind of misses the forest for the trees, which is your customers. The majority of their journey is taking place somewhere that you have no, very little control over. So it's not your website, it's not your booth, it's not your ebook. It's a podcast they're listening to. It's LinkedIn that they're scrolling and
Yep.
hearing about things from their peers, from their friends. Um, and the thing that I like about this is, one, it acknowledges this fundamental reality, but two, it centers the customer in a more human way. So we're not just focusing on clicks and conversions and tracking them with 6 different pixels across the whole of the internet. Is kind of taking a step back and saying, who is my customer as a person, what matters to them, where do they hang out, what do they like, and then once we kind of understand them as a person and maybe put them into a corresponding persona, then we can say, this is who this person is. Here's how I am going to kind of bridge the gap to get in front of them in a way that is meaningful to them, and like you said, is not selling to them necessarily.
It's authentic. It's authentic.
Yeah.
And there's a Gardner or Forrester quote. I don't know which one, but it's like it says 75% of the decision is made before the person picks up the phone, calls you, walks into your store. And that's a B2B stat. So they're
Mm-hmm.
making these decisions well before they get to anything that you've created, unless you're a really smart marketer, because you have potentially seeded some of this stuff out in the world to help them understand that you're the obvious choice.
Right. So I have one more question here, and then I think we're probably coming up on time. Um, so I wanted to talk, and you alluded to this a bit earlier, which is I wanted to talk about what happens when you are performing research as for a client, and it doesn't align with their kind of internal consensus on who their customer is, what's great about their product. It kind of challenges their worldview. So I know you mentioned, oh, sometimes we have people come to us and they bring us the problem, and in so doing, kind of bring you the solution, which makes you say, well, what are we doing here? If you if you have it all figured out, what do you need me for?
Right.
So I'm curious, like, have you ever had a client who's they're just 100% sure, they're like, hey, this is for sure who our customer is, or this is for sure what their the main drivers of these behaviors are, and then you do the research and you say, hey, actually, we're seeing something different. So has that happened? And then how do you address it when it does happen?
So it happens 98% of the time. Very, very few companies come to us with sophisticated persona or customer understanding. And if they do, we may have built it for them. There are a few examples I can think of that have done a great job and they know their personas, and then we go and test against them. But that's also like it's a sophisticated conversation you're having. They haven't like, gone behind a wall and pretended to create personas. They have like primary research. So my expectation is at the end of the day, I'm going to say you are wrong, and this is how it needs to happen. It's also why I'm unemployable, because I'm the guy that comes in the room and says, so, this isn't like you guys have been talking about this in the boardroom for the past whatever. And I'm sorry, but it's just not the way that it works. We were never agency friendly, because they would bring us something and we would kill it in a couple of days of studies, and because we put it in front of the person they intended it for, and the person would say, I'd never use that. And if they'd done just a small amount of research in the beginning, they would have known that. So we're so set to go build a thing first than to kind of think about it along the way and then build it, because the iterations on that, it just feels like it's a longer path, but honestly it isn't. You can keep yourself from doing the wrong thing. So I would say that's my common path, is to be the person who comes in and goes, you thought it was this, but it was really this. And what's good about that is it's not always a wholesale destruction. Like we're not going in and saying it's a terrible idea. It's like, it's not a bad idea, but we need to make these little tweaks, right? Like we got to do this with the approach, think about it this way. You still can do it, but we just need to like make sure you use these words or you approach the activation this way, and you're going to be far more successful with it.
And can you kind of describe how you facilitate that buy-in from internal teams, especially internal marketing teams? Because I can definitely see some tension there if you come in and have wildly different research findings, and they've been operating under this a certain paradigm, and you come in and kind of like pop the bubble. Um, do you have a specific approach to creating that buy-in?
Think that that's why including people that are the actual customers in the conversation is the best. Like I love it when there's a researcher in the room and I will say something and then everyone looks at the researcher, and the researcher, if they say yes, everyone believes it. It's like the gospel. So having that, which is again why it's a combination of like you've got qualitative, primary, secondary, like all these things. The most powerful research is primary qualitative research. Like I sat across the room or talk to or use some interface that gets to the people that are intended to use this, and they're telling you no. And I can point to why some of your metrics may not be working the way that you expect, or this has been a failure before. So that person is the most powerful person in the room in those situations because everyone looks at them. It's interesting doing like true qualitative, and when we were doing it lab based, we would suggest they talk to like 12 to 16 people, right, over a period of time. And the executive that would complain that we weren't going to talk to enough people would be the one that was ready to change everything after they heard the first person say that it wasn't right. And I was always like, well, we're not convinced of that yet. So like, let's listen to the rest of the people and make sure we actually have a pattern here. But I'm glad that you're drinking the Kool-Aid, right? So yeah, so really, it's not me saying it. I don't have a horse in the race. And in fact, as a third party, like when I walk out the door, like my paycheck isn't necessarily tied to whether or not this thing's going to be successful. So why would I want to just be an antagonist? Right. So you have to think of people's motive.
Right. And I mean, I like what you're capturing there, which is just listen to your customers.
Yeah.
And there's a caveat there, which is you have to talk to enough of them and kind of triangulate on what is the actual ground truth. Like you said, you can't just listen to the first person and be like, "Cool, we're changing everything."
Good.
Yeah,
All
we're
right.
good.
All right. I called my neighbor because he does this. It's like, no, 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 no. My next door neighbor knows all that. I'm like, no, your next door neighbor doesn't. Like, it's not that, right? So yeah. So it is, you want to know what your customers want, ask them. You just have to ask them in the right way, right? Like you got to make sure it's in a way that's non-biased, that gets to the root of what it is. You have some patterns, and then it becomes a gospel. It's so powerful. If it's done correctly, it's just an amazing way to create a successful initiative, project, company on the back end.
Amazing. That's very well said. I have two rapid fire questions for you, and then we can wrap up here.
Okay.
One is kind of do you have any hot takes or spicy perspectives on research insights, what people are doing well, what people can improve, anything like that?
Well, people lean too heavily into quantitative studies and they don't know how to write a good question. So just because you know how to turn up a survey tool doesn't mean you become a researcher, right? Because you can write a biased question. I can write a survey to get to what I want it to say very easily. So don't, buyer beware when you start to like, hey, we'll just put out a survey tool. Maybe not. So yeah.
That's a good one. And then last one is, can you just tell people, where to find you? Any sort of like, if you have a podcast CTA you want to do, just let people know, yeah, who you are, what you do, and where they can find you if they want to learn more.
Yeah, so my social media platform of choice right now is LinkedIn. So you'll find me as Eric Holtzclaw on LinkedIn. Liger Partners is our website, and I do have a podcast called The Claw, and The Claw is targeted at C-suite marketing executives. So we talk about all things marketing and debunk the myths of marketing.
Great. Well, I would encourage people to go check you out on the Claw. Nice integration of your last name there. That's 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 a good one. That's gonna stick. See, good marketing all the
Hey,
way through.
and the
Not gonna
company
forget that one.
Liger, so the Liger has a claw too, so it all works together. So yeah.
Oh man, the mastermind, plan is just unveiling itself here. Cool. So I think we can wrap here, Eric. This has been wonderful talking to you. I know that I learned a ton. I'm sure everyone who watches this will also learn a ton, both about the world B2B marketing, but also how to leverage insights and research, as a marketer. So thank you so much for your time, and again, really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for inviting me. Appreciate it.
Yeah.